This is the Authority Partners podcast.
Hello, everyone. I am Aisha Chebo, and I will be your host for today. I am a QA engineer and have been working with Authority Partners for a little bit over 3.5 years. And today with me, I have Rabina Yusufovic, also a QA engineer that has been working with Authority Partners for a little bit over a year. Today, we will be discussing manual versus automation testing and how to combine these two.
Hello, Aisha. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to discuss this topic with you.
So after we got that out of the way, let's dive in right into it. For starters, let's discuss what does being a QA engineer actually entail.
For starters, in layman terms, a QA engineer is responsible for testing, monitoring software processes and product to ensure a general compliance against defined standards. So generally, QA engineers work on creating tests, which will hopefully identify issues with the software before the product launch. But when we're speaking about quality assurance, it's more of a process than a title. Quality assurance is a part of quality management with a focus on providing confidence for a specific product, but it also entails maintenance of a desired level of quality, especially in the process of the delivery of the product. With that being said, it should be implemented on every level of a product delivery, and it all starts at the development phase. So quality assurance should play a key part in everything we do.
I agree with everything being said, definitely, but I want to focus on that last part, the point where quality assurance should be implemented on every level of product delivery. And it all definitely starts with writing quality code. So it can definitely be said that quality of a product does not only depend on QA engineers, but on the entire team and is a responsibility of the entire team.
I definitely agree. I think that there's usually a lot of negative energy between developers and QAs. And not to state everything wrongly, QAs are responsible for signing off a product, but it should generally be viewed as a collaborative effort.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And now that we've got that defined, let's also define what we mean when we say manual testing and what do we mean when we say automation testing.
When we're speaking generally about it, manual testing is performed by a human, a QA engineer, whereas automation testing is done with the use of a script, code, and generally automation tools. Manual testing is performed to discover bugs of a product that is under development. It can cover a various number of testing types, such as exploratory or ad hoc, whereas automation testing, we write scripts that validate the software. Automated testing allows us to execute repetitive tasks and regression testing without the intervention of a manual tester, but this does not necessarily mean that automation does not require any manual efforts.
Yes, of course, but I'm a person that likes, examples of everything. So let's put this into perspective. Let's say we got a big system and a new feature is being developed. The whole system has around 500 test cases, which for a big project isn't a quite large number, but let's keep it at 500 for, these purposes. And with the new feature, we're adding, an additional 25 test cases. And then let's say we also have a QA manual team that consists of 5 persons. And since the release is coming up, they need to do testing of the entire platform, of course, which means executing 525 test cases. Divided into 5 persons, that's 105 test cases per QA engineer. And let's say the average time of executing a test is more or less 15 minutes. That means that every person will need approximately 26 hours to complete all of their test cases. If, of course, all of them work only on that, they will need around 3.5 days, which is a lot. And that number will become bigger and bigger with time and adding new features, of course, to the entire system. So can automation actually help out with this?
Well, yes, Aisha, of course it can. People usually run away from automation because opposed to manual testing, it takes more time to set up. In order to execute a test case manually, all you need is a QA. But with automation, you need at least some sort of a framework and a number of written up scripts. This obviously means that a certain amount of effort has to be designated to the actual setup in order to execute it. But if we look at the big picture, automated software testing can expand the scope and depth of tests to improve the quality of any software. It's possible to execute lengthy tests unsupervised, which is not the case with manual testing. And even more, machines with various setups can run the automated scripts. Automated software testing can examine an application's internal program states, data tables, file contents, check if it's functioning as intended, and this obviously would require major manual labor. Every test can be run easily, include the execution of hundreds of distinct complicated test cases, giving test coverage that is not achievable with manual tests. With that being said, taking your example into consideration, running 525 tests would take approximately 4 hours with the proper infrastructure.
So with all of that information, let's say we have, only half of those test cases actually automated and half of them still not automated. That would halve down the time for the manual testing to 1.5 days, and the other half will actually be done running, since it of course needs 4 hours while they are doing the manual testing. And going through potential failures, of course, if everything is working properly, should not take more than 1 to 2 hours if it's a joint effort. So basically, with implementing automation for half of the test cases, it will almost cut time for testing in half. But there is an effort that needs to be taken in consideration when writing automated test cases.
Well, of course, sure there is. We can all agree that testing a product manually is both expensive and time-consuming, but automated tests can be run frequently with a little additional cost that we add to maintaining them, and are generally significantly faster than executing a manual test. The question naturally arises itself: why should we automate when it could take, let's say, 8 to 16 hours to develop a test case? The general problem is the approach, where we need to understand the differences between manual and automation testing and when to implement each. We have to understand that they're two separate entities with different goals when we implement them. And let's take into consideration like tedious manual testing. Even the most meticulous tester will make mistakes. Every time they're run, automated tests carry out the same exact process and never forget to capture thorough results. The time saved from not having to repeat manual tests allows testers to develop new automated software tests and work with complicated features. There are certain aspects that manual testing cannot cover. For example, like performance testing. A controlled web application test with thousands of users cannot be carried out, not even by the biggest software and QA departments. Tens, hundreds, or even thousands of virtual users interacting with a network, software, or a web application can be simulated through automated testing.
I agree totally. After all of this is said, it looks like everything should be automated and that automation is the way to go. I personally do not agree 100% with that point. So can you tell me, should we automate everything, and what is your opinion on that?
Personally, yes, we should automate everything, but with according prioritization. Obviously, certain test cases will be better automation candidates than others, but it's really important to note that automating everything does not eliminate manual work. We can do manual testing without automation, but no automation can be done without any manual efforts.
I agree with that point for manual work, but in my opinion, if we're going to automate everything, then our test cases need to be very well defined and not overlapping, and test suite for a specific feature needs to take automation into consideration, which again proves your point that automation testing cannot be done without any manual labor. In this case, specifically meaning requirements reading and understanding and designing the best test suite for a functionality with thinking ahead of automation.
Yes, it all comes down to having a granular backlog and the entire process implemented to the best of our ability.
Okay, if we are automating everything, you mentioned that no automation can be done without manual work. So what exactly did you mean by that?
Although automated testing typically improves testing uniformity and speed, it is only as effective as the scripts we create. So in order to find problems from the viewpoint of the user or any unanticipated bugs from any unplanned scenarios, manual testing is actually complementary to automated testing. Along with effective automation, there is a great need for human testing heuristics. We have to keep in mind that exhaustive testing is impossible, and there's no way we can cover every scenario without automated scripts.
So it seems that we have a need for combining the two, which is also, in my opinion, the way to go. But the question arises, does the perfect ratio of combining the two exist, and how do we implement it?
This is where the podcast becomes clickbait. There is no definitive answer. There is no defined perfect ratio. It all depends on the needs of the project you're working on. The new reality of Agile and DevOps requires generally a new strategy where testing leaders must coordinate testing efforts across all testing tools and approaches, starting with manual testing, which can be either scripted or exploratory, and then moving through the team's functional automated efforts and ending with unit and integration tests run by the CI/CD framework.
That all makes sense, and I agree totally. One of the main principles of testing is context dependent, which actually means that we cannot apply the same sets of tests in QA mindsets to various projects. Every software expresses a need for different test cases because every software has a specific purpose. You cannot test, let's say, Facebook and Amazon with same tests naturally. But are there at least some kind of guidelines for implementing a perfect ratio of automation and manual effort for a specific software?
Even though automated testing is becoming more popular, manual testing is not going away. In actuality, each sort of testing performs a distinct role in the QA process, and when combined, they in some way enhance one another. Understanding the differences between the two methodologies and how they differ in execution, implementation, and the scope of test quality coverage are important considerations when making a choice. Manual tests are used to assess the product's quality, value, user experience, as well as to identify flaws and potential improvement areas, whereas automated tests are used to monitor changes that could indicate problems, as well as to maintain the product's functional and non-functional stability. The contrast between the two is difficult to acknowledge sometimes, but is nonetheless very necessary. The second and most important tip is to pay attention to the test's nature. While writing manual tests is relatively inexpensive, running them costs money. So it requires hiring and training testers. That's a lot of time and effort to put in. It requires for the tester to get familiar with the process of a specific environment and generally learn the business logic. Whereas unlike automated tests, which cost, let's say, relatively more to write, they cost less to execute.
I think the manual testing will never actually go away. I mean, there are some limitations to automation. There are some tools, but automation cannot really identify if some random button is off for 10 pixels, either to the right or to the left. Automation can check if the button is there or not, and clickable or not, but positioning can be really hard to determine. Nonetheless, with all your points, it all seems very easy, but it cannot really boil down to just those two. Are there any more things that should be also taken into consideration?
We do have to keep in mind the execution time, coverage, and results. Execution time for a manual tester is always longer than, let's say, the automated one. But on the other hand, manual tests are easier to adapt and they cover higher level requirements, whereas automation typically covers lower level tests and they tend to be rigid unless rewritten or updated frequently. On the other hand, when we're looking at results of manual testing are directly related to the tester who conducted them and are typically an indicator of a bug if we eliminate out the testing errors. But with automation tests, they're not affected by the human subjectivity and they might indicate a bug, but they also might be false negatives and they have to be investigated and then either updated or they are a sign of a failure.
So, of course, there's points for automation and there's points for manual testing. I'm always up for combining the both and finding some perfect ratio for the specific, project I'm working on. But what is mainly your way to go?
Automation, in my opinion, is the way to go. And in my humble experience, writing them requires a lot of work upfront, but pays off in the long term. It's important to keep in mind, though, that they do require far more upkeep than manual test cases and aren't necessarily a sign of a bug. As we've stated, with manual efforts, if we find an issue, it's usually that there's something wrong with the system, whereas automated tests typically result in far more failed test cases and false negatives than they do true issues. But however, I still vote for the latter to do most of the work, having a stable regression suite and implementing manual testing when and if needed, and having manual testing as a magic wand that comes out to play on occasion would be the best of both worlds.
Well, that beautifully concludes today's topic. It was a lovely discussion, Rabina, and thank you for joining me in this Authority Partners podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Authority Partners podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode.